Welcome to the AI Frame podcast, a space where we explore how founders, innovators, and investors are navigating the world of artificial intelligence. Each episode brings you thoughtful conversations with people redefining how technology meets strategy, separating what's real from what is noise. I'm Ana Rojo-Taurua, doctor in mathematics, AI consultant and strategist, and your host. So grab a coffee and let's frame the future of AI together. Today, I'm joined by Dr. John Fletcher, CEO and co-founder of the Innovation Game, which is tackling a really important question. How do we keep algorithm innovation open instead of letting it become controlled by a small number of large tech companies? John has a PhD in applied mathematics and theoretical physics from the University of Cambridge and has spent the last several years researching distributed incentive systems. He's also the inventor of more than 30 patents in cryptography and distributed systems. So today, we're going to talk about algorithm discovery, why it might need new incentives, how the innovation game is trying to reward open innovation, and what this means for the future of AI. From open versus closed models to AI for mathematics, and deeper technical progress. So John, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks very much, Anna. I am doing very well indeed. Thank you. Great to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about who you are and also what's your mission.
I'm a guy with a PhD in maths and theoretical physics. I stayed in the academic world for a couple of years after my PhD, but then I went into a commercial world, and I got particularly interested in algorithms, which was sort of the subject, albeit sort of a narrow kind of domain on which I did my PhD. And I've become sort of increasingly interested as well in the economics of science. I think when science, or any field, in fact, gets to a certain size, that it almost becomes entangled with economics, because you can do the best work often if you have more kind of investment, that you have kind of more people working on your program of research or what you think is interesting. And I guess this has always been the case to some extent, but with things like sort of AI being really kind of industrial scale, it's sort of become more obvious. And so I started thinking about the problem of, what are the kind of most important layers of this whole technology stack, in the modern world. And, we really came to the conclusion that algorithms were sort of underappreciated aspects that people had sort of taken for granted because they weren't a differentiator historically. So they're incredibly powerful, but sort of everybody had more or less the same ones. They differentiated on other factors. But now we're moving into an era where that won't be the case anymore. And that's, as we'll probably dig into, quite a significant shift.
That's something that I want to talk about a little bit more further down the line. But for now, I want you to tell us a little bit more about what the innovation game is. If you could explain a little bit more, like simple terms, how would you describe it?
My favorite way of describing it is almost as a combination between the ideas of around Linux and the ideas around Bitcoin. So Linux and Bitcoin are sort of very different things, and a lot of people are sort of into open source, and Linux are not really sort of Bitcoin people or crypto people more generally. But Linux, as many people know, is like a very important movement, going along with the rest of the open source movement. But it was a massively collaborative project where people can build on one another's work. And it really sort of showed that open innovation, in a sense, can be, if the incentives are correct, can be more powerful than any sort of closed project. Linux, to those people don't know, is an operating system which is really become almost completely dominant now. I mean, all of the Apple Macs basically run on a derivative of Linux, and sort of iOS and Android mobile systems. Almost every kind of server farm runs on Linux too. And this, in some sense, was a kind of response to some concerns about Microsoft getting a monopoly on the operating system layer, roughly 25 years ago. And but because they sort of build on one another's work, it now Linux is almost accelerating away from its nearest closed competition, and it will probably never be caught. So this is a kind of an inspiring example, which a lot of people point to, and it sort of gives them hope when they want to because they want for various reasons, software to sort of remain open and be the best possible software and most responsive and fix bugs most quickly and so on. But one of the interesting things about it was never really driven by monetary incentives, at least not directly. So most of the people who contribute to links do so for other reasons. It's not like, they'll make a contribution and they'll get paid for that. In certain domains, notably AI, you really have to have monetary incentives because a lot of sort of development and improvement is done by machines, and machines, they don't really run on goodwill or kudos or anything like that. They sort of run on US dollars. So to me, I took an inspiration from Bitcoin. It has some things in common with Linux. It's sort of it decentralized. It's an open source project. They have monetary flows going all the way around the world. In particular, sort of Bitcoin miners are paid, for the computational work that they do. And it does have some interesting properties, such as, they have this big market for, machines or microchips that do nothing but, compute SHA-256 hashes now. And that was a market that was sort of, it didn't exist before. You get precisely zero if you do a hash, before Bitcoin existed. But now if you hash some block and you come up with a kind of particular number, you can get, thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. So it was really a kind of an interesting quirk. They created a market for hashes. They created a market for ASIC, chips, special microchips that do nothing but hash. And this is all kind of grew out of the fact that, you could make money. There was an incentive on offer. And so I started to think about, if we want to market for algorithms or an open algorithms, maybe we can construct some kind of economic machine, perhaps taking inspiration from Bitcoin that created such a market and, priced contributions in the sense that it rewarded better algorithms more than it rewarded inferior algorithms. And this was this sort of combination that I found so intriguing. And that's what I would describe the innovation game as. It's like a big algorithm Formula One race where people are trying to get the fastest algorithm, and they are rewarded in tokens, and so maybe like Bitcoin for algorithms or Formula One for algorithms is a good way to express it. But everything is, very importantly, everything is open, so everybody can always build on one another's work.
It's not just about rewarding, but it's also about measuring what is the best algorithm, and people actually compete to try to find this best algorithm. So can you talk a little bit more about that and what better means in this context?
It is, as you probably know, it's quite a tricky question to say which algorithm is better than another. In sort of domains, they have some measures, and some of the measures work in some circumstances and they fail in some circumstances. And they have a kind of, a tapestry of different ways to measure them. But in our case, we needed something particularly robust because obviously if some guys try to find a better algorithm and they found some kind of way to game the system, then they're really just going to do that, right? It's a sort of permissionless, so it has to be very robust. For the more kind of, so technical lessons here, they have this sort of, just as an example, something called like big O notation. They say, oh, my algorithm got better because now it can, calculate something in sort of, n log n time rather than n squared time. But one of the things about this, not to dig too deeply into it, but that's a sort of asymptotic complexity, as they call it. And then sometimes you get examples whereby, okay, like I've got a better asymptotic complexity, but it's like the asymptote converges so slowly that it's like, it's better asymptotically, but in practice, for any kind of reasonable size of problem, it's inferior. So we can't, these kinds of abstract measures that work sometimes and don't are really kind of no good to us in our particular field. So what we sort of hit upon was it's really just a situation whereby we have these people, kind of a network of participants performing proof of work in the innovation game, which is kind of analogous to how you have proof of work miners in Bitcoin. And what they're trying to do is solve as many sort of randomly generated instances of a particular problem of a chosen kind of reasonable size. The problems get bigger and bigger, maybe slowly, but they're always solvable, by definition. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And then we just look at which algorithm the miners use in practice. So if you think about it, it's quite a good way because that even integrates things like, what hardware are people using. So you could have a situation where you have a great algorithm and you say, oh, it's much faster, but it only has its advantage on this particular piece of hardware, which is very expensive and has low availability and nobody has. Yeah. And so in our particular case, that wouldn't get rewarded because it's a sort of, it's a situation which is abstract. Like in practice, they might have a different hardware. And so it kind of accounts for a cost benefit of analysis. It will kind of integrate information about maybe availability of hardware and performance of hardware, not these kind of abstract measures that can be gamed. You see what I mean? Like, oh yeah, that sounds great. It gets a high value on this metric, but in practice that it's actually meaningless for some kind of special reason. So one way to think about it, in fact, is not sure if this is very helpful. It's almost like you probably know the concepts of an analog computer, where you have a sort of a system which is sort of analogous to some maybe physical system that is of interest. That's where the word analog computer it comes from. It's an analogy. So a great example of analog computer is like a wind tunnel, for example. Like you might put in a scale model or maybe a full-size model if it's a car, but if it's a plane or a ship or something, you put in some kind of scale model, and then you sort of, I don't know, get some water or some air to flow by. And then you just sort of take the measurements off. You say, like, how stable is it? What's it doing? And it's actually performing a computation, right? But you're using like an analog of a real car or an analog of a real ship or a real plane, maybe a kind of scale model to, build some intuition and see, whether your design is correct or not. So in the innovation game, the participants performing proof of work are almost like a sort of scale model of the real market for these algorithms. But in our case, it's sort of, it's very transparent. We can see which algorithm each of them are using. They have to report them and we can check. And so we really have a sort of visibility into the market dynamics, right, which you don't have in the real market, necessarily. So we basically create this sort of contrived thing, and then we just sort of read off the properties. This guy's, this one is more popular, this algorithm's less popular, and we use that market signal, as it's called, to decide how to reward people. So we couldn't, the real market wasn't sufficiently transparent. We couldn't get the information we needed. So we created this analog market. And that's really, I would say, the kind of core inside, the most special thing about the innovation game, because otherwise the issue of like how to decide which algorithm is better than another and how much it deserves to get rewarded is just sort of, so complex. And also, there could be things like disagreements, and some people are like, oh, my algorithm was better than his, or it got rewarded more and stuff. And interestingly, with markets, they kind of sweep all of that away. People just sort of accept it. And if markets get things wrong, right, but it's the market's fault, it's not our fault. And actually that is quite important for community cohesion. So I guess that was the big insight, the sort of the secret sauce of the innovation game.
I think it's so interesting, right? Because it has a lot of layers of complexity, the problem of determining what algorithm is better, right?
Yes.
And something that you were talking about is one of this dimension is popularity. So the more you use it, the more is indicated that is better. But I would argue that we see this in society a lot. Just because lots of people do something doesn't mean that that is the best thing or even good. How do you flag when popularity is not an indicator of this algorithm is good?
I would say that this is quite a key difference between, say, the concept of a market and establishing something through a market signal and establishing something through a vote. You're right that, what most people say or, maybe at least claim to believe is often, sort of quite far from the truth. This is one of the reasons why people don't let, the populace vote on where the scientific funding should go, for example, because unfortunately, probably all go on aliens and stuff which isn't necessarily, no wonder, right? Because not everybody is a trained scientist. You might say, democracy is a great thing, but it has its limits, right? If you don't know, kind of what to vote for, you don't have the necessary kind of background or knowledge, your vote will just be sort of arbitrary, or more precisely, you'll vote for whoever spends the most on advertising. This is kind of typical, which isn't necessarily the best thing. So in this case, if someone performing proof of work, like a minor in the innovation game, uses, say, an inferior algorithm, maybe it's because it's the one that their friend submitted or something like that. It's kind of all these sorts of things. So they want him to get rewarded. well, if the algorithm's inferior, they'll put themselves at a disadvantage in terms that they'll be less competitive in proof of work. So it'd be a bit like using an ASIC miner, which is a less efficient one because they were the ones that your friend was selling, rather than, the best one. But of course, there's a sort of monetary penalty to that. You could have a situation where somebody sort of submits an algorithm and it's basically the same, but they kind of like that. Maybe they changed a couple of things, but they weren't meaningful. And then, maybe they're going to switch over to that one because it was like their friend who, did a bit of a trick. But there's also like algorithms that are submitted later. So they can be submitted on a sort of weekly window. And if you wanted to copy somebody else's idea, obviously you would submit yours at least a week later. And there's a little bit of a penalty for an algorithm that has the same performance but is submitted later, has a little bit of a handicap, let's say. So it's like only ones with some kind of substantial bump would be able to overcome that handicap and then some, and then they would naturally get adopted. If they were adopted by some guy who was adopting it for some other reason, that might be the case, but you have to have a lot of compute. So you'd have to get, currently you have to get at least 25% of adoption before your algorithm will receive anything. So they would have to be sort of like faking that and getting over this handicap level. And also other people wouldn't switch, like people won't switch generally to something that's of an equal performance because they just can't be bothered, right? Well, that's the point. They'll see only if it's a substantial bump will they switch. So they wouldn't get many people following them. So basically there are various mechanisms in place, and this, all I can say is that it seems in practice to be working. We do look at the algorithms quite hard. We really don't want people to be just copying other people's and pretending that they're different, of course, and getting then the reward gets taken from the person who really made the contribution to somebody else. There were a couple of attempts in the early days to do it. And now it doesn't seem to happen. The mechanisms, at least at the present time, seem to be sufficient. And they should sort of scale with size as well. So it's not as if, as this thing gets bigger, it's necessarily more likely to happen because, the mining network gets bigger and so the loss is commensurately big. So it sort of would scale with the value of the token. Fingers crossed, it seems to be, so far so good.
We are talking about AI, but not only about AI. This is algorithms in general, right?
In our case, it's lower level stuff. It would be things more like, I don't know, a sorting algorithm or a fast Fourier transform or that kind of thing. So if you try to submit an algorithm that was like, I don't know, I think it's like more than 10 megabytes or something like that, it wouldn't, because they'll sort of like go on the blockchain and be stored there and so on. So we don't want these enormous, multi-gigabyte or terabyte large language models. We couldn't even sort of take them if we wanted to. So it's basically a lower level, more fundamental level, people always try and get me to say, than the large language models. So white box, basically interpretable algorithms. Those are what we focus on.
Do you think there is scope for large language models?
The problem is with large language models, unless you also get the algorithmic methods by which they were trained and all the training data, which is obviously a vast amount of information, obviously, you can't really build on top of the work meaningfully. So you can often improve them on a certain subset of domains, like by fine tuning, often at the cost of making them worse at other things. But a lot of the time, you don't really know what you're doing. You're sort of getting you're sort of tweaking, moving things about until it gets sort of slightly better at this and slightly worse at something else. So it's not really open source if you just have the weights, because you're not building upon the basic components from which it's made. And so it would be, I wouldn't rule it out, but it would be quite difficult. A lot of people don't even want to give the training data for reasons to do with potential copyright lawsuits in the future. So it's very, very rare, in fact, to get a genuine open source large language model where they fully specify the data in the algorithmic methods. We don't really focus on that. There are some other people who focus on that. But again, it is open weights, but it's not open source, because unless you have all that information, you cannot build upon the work and make a strict improvement upon what came before.
Just for the audience, so when we talk about open models, there are two types. One is open weight and the other one is open source. So open weights, that mean that the weights that the model has been trained on are available, but that doesn't mean that the training data is available. With open source, you do have the training data available, and that's what gives you full flexibility to do whatever you want with the model. Large language models and small language models are not all what constitutes AI, right? It's probably like a 0.05% of what AI is. So do you consider other algorithms that fall into the AI umbrella that are not LLMs?
Yeah. So, I mean, famously, what's called the attention mechanism is a kind of algorithm. The transformer sort of came out of that, I think, a few years later. They have other important algorithms, things like optimizers for non-convex optimization. This is sort of, you have a kind of a point moving around a surface with lots of kind of local minima and high dimensions.
Yeah.
And the algorithm which decides where to go is a very important part of AI in general. But it's kind of in the plumbing about how the AI models are created, but it sits at a lower level. And yeah, so these are the kinds of things that the innovation game is focused on. The public don't really seem to pay as much attention to this thing. Of course, they're kind of highly focused on the model. But the thing is, these are they're very, very important. And it really was the transformer and the attention mechanism which gave rise to the current AI revolution. It wasn't better hardware or more data. It was that.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, a transformer is a neural network. And there are lots of components on that neural network that you can make better, that are just algorithms, one like sequence one after another until you get this full architecture. And the way that you are architecting a neural network, this particular type with the encoder and the decoder and each one with all its layers, right? That's what gives you the transformer. And I guess what you could do is take parts of this architecture and try to improve each part, right? Am I
Absolutely.
right? Okay.
Absolutely. So that it really is, in my view, and this view seems to be becoming quite mainstream now. The most gains are going to come from that, basically sort of algorithmic methods, better ways to train, as opposed to, more powerful hardware. You will get gains from that, but it will be very, very small compared to if somebody found a better alternative to the transformer and so on.
I keep saying this. People are really focused on let's make bigger models. Let's throw in more data into our models. And I'm like, hold on a second. Why don't we look at the model in particular? Why don't we try to change the model so it scales better? So maybe the limitation is not the amount of data that we throw into the model, but how the model is architected so it can handle the computational limitations that we are facing at the moment. And I was wondering what your thoughts on this are.
Absolutely. So that's where the big gains will come. It's also where one thing that we're concerned about is centralization of AI. If it does get, monopolized and centralized, it will be because somebody discovers something like that or develops something like that and doesn't share it. And there's a lot of focus on, people talking about open source AI or decentralized AI. They're not focusing on keeping the algorithms a layer open, which is the most important thing. They tend to focus on things like, like you say, like trading bigger models and, saying that we do have open models or at least open weights models available now. But what if the big companies that create them stop creating them? So then they think maybe we need decentralized training so lots of smaller people can get together and create a model. I think that that's a sort of an overblow. We know that there are open models made available now that actually seem to be very competitive and even catching up with the closed state of the art. But interestingly, there's lots of other nation states. I mean, there's about 30 nation states saying that they're going to train their own AI models and make them available as well. And to my mind, this shouldn't be too surprising because it's a bit like, how they have news channels like France 24 and Al Jazeera and all that kind of stuff. Like these things are incredibly expensive to run. They're often massively loss-making, but they don't run them for profit. They run them because people get information from there and they want to put their version of events, probably insert their biases in there. And so these things will always be made available because there's a strong incentive to do that. So I don't think they're going to just say no more open models. We're going to pull the rug from that. Not because they're good natured. It's just because increasingly people get their information and their view of the world from AIs, probably from talking to AIs and asking them about topics they don't understand. Yeah. And so I feel that these things will always be created and probably largely made available for free. But of course, only if the raw materials to make them, a competitive one, of course, a reasonably, performant one, are available. Yeah. And the main reason why that might not happen is because somebody finds a better algorithmic method and it's just like, you're not going to use, China's AI model or whatever if it's just massively inferior in terms of performance, to one that made by an American company. So, I don't think many people are out there saying, oh, we need to be able to create a giant decentralized CNN, like the world, depends upon that.
Yeah.
It's like, it would be nice if you had one, but it's not that, people are going to be broadcasting the truth, at least about the people that are their competitors, right? But the main thing is, like, if like only one person had a television camera, for example, and nobody else knew how to make one, that would be a sort of almost destabilizing imbalance of power. And that's what could happen with algorithmic methods, I think, if they're developed and kept private.
But I think there is an imbalance, right? Especially in the AI world, where you do need lots of money and lots of infrastructure and lots of computer power to build something and to run something that is competitive.
Training frontier AI models, it's hard to see that it ever won't be really expensive, right? Because it's almost just like an arms race. Like if it becomes less expensive, they'll just make them better and bigger and more expensive to run. And then the one that they put more energy in will presumably outcompete the smaller one. There is a reasonable amount of competition in terms of how many people can afford the hardware, how many people can scrape the data. Most of the data is just scraped from the internet. So it's all actually kind of, for general reasoning models anyway, almost everything that's useful, at least currently, is just you can scrape it from the internet. It's not necessarily illegal because of copyright, but it's not held in some silo that you can't access, right?
Yeah.
You can get all the books ever written and all the papers ever written. You can just sort of download them. In principle, the data kind of issue is sort of, roughly equal between everybody. The hardware, I mean, the thing is about hardware is the economies of scale are so massive that it's like it's always in the interest of a hardware company to sell as many units as possible because their profitability just rockets. And so it seems, economics kind of, you tend to suggest that hardware, although expensive, will be available at some price. It's a bit of a pity that you do need this, but I think the most important point is the last one that you made. So the question, this all sort of assumes that they have the algorithmic methods available, which are roughly state of the art. And if somebody does find a better one, you're either going to sort of just publish it openly or keep it secret. And if you are some kind of smart person and you don't own all of these complementary assets, you don't own all of these GPUs already, then it's almost like, what do you do with it? Like, what's the incentive to develop it? And the interesting thing is, this is the real twist, is that there's a pretty good chance that the next, generation of neural network architecture, for example, is going to be developed by a machine. AI for mathematics now is becoming so successful, but now AI is becoming so kind of successful at mathematics that, the people who already own the GPUs are more likely than other people, or increasingly so, to find the next generation of, a neural network architecture. And even if they are sort of philosophically aligned with open source, which you have no reason to believe they necessarily would be, it's almost impossible for them to just publish it openly. Because you think about what's happening. If they've put $1 billion of compute into finding that, how can they just give it to all their competitors? They paid for it, and yet everybody benefits from it.
Exactly.
So the economics are pushing them towards keeping it closed, which historically hasn't been the case. These things were developed openly. A lot of it was because it was developed in an academic context where the funding is sort of contingent on open publication because it's public money.
Yeah.
But things are changing now. And that really is problematic, basically. If this thing kind of goes dark, it's going to be such an advantage to one party that it changes all sorts of incentives. It can be highly disruptive. Those people could surveil other people. They could put out propaganda that was like so clever and indistinguishable from reality and come up with all sorts of, it's weird. Like, it's never been a situation where intelligence or, a technology of such power could credibly be monopolized.
And you were talking about neural networks. Is the next algorithm that is going to, transform the AI world again, not a neural network? Is it something different? What do you think?
Quite possibly. I mean, that it does seem that computers think in different ways to people. So, there's a question of whether it's sort of superior, all things considered. But then there's also a question of it just sort of takes different strategies which human beings don't tend to think of. I mean, there's this kind of great example apparently in the game of Go. It sort of opened up this whole new area. It's basically stuff that nobody had ever thought about.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that adding that kind of curveball means there's a lot more scope for something kind of different, quite fundamentally different. In a sense, that's even more worrying because, historically, we do see that the biggest leaps come from just pretty major breaks with the past in terms of like the kind of, sort of paradigm shifting thing. I mean, I think paradigm shifts are great, but the thing is we've always become used to them being open overwhelmingly, right? Where some guy invents some kind of really radical new way of looking at the world, which is a lot more sophisticated and advanced. They normally don't just keep that to themselves and exploit it somehow.
Yeah.
And which would give them power over others. But in this case, there's more chance of that happening than ever before. So what the innovation game really wants to leverage is the fact that, I mean, at least at the present time, there's much more compute outside of Google than there is inside of Google, for example. And as long as you're kind of staying in touch with the algorithmic methods, you could plausibly start to get ahead of Google, right? If you're sort of mining for better algorithms, mining for better results, because you have more compute. But that sort of course, that assumes that the people are building on top of other weak people's work and it's sort of open that the Google hasn't gotten too far ahead. So I think that this is plausible. And, we've seen with Linux that's the way that it worked. Windows will probably never catch up. And hopefully, the state of the art in algorithms could be the same, public and accelerating too quickly for a private alternative to catch up.
What is something that the AI industry believes today that you strongly disagree with?
Oh, that's a great one. There are probably several things. So one is this kind of new trend of, I would say, environmental learning, which I do think is interesting. People say, and if you look at the kind of original paper, I think it was all kind of kicked off by this this paper entitled "The Bitter Lesson." I think it was a guy called and where he was saying that everything should be kind of like scaled to take in as little data as possible, like in a sense, because then because otherwise you just run out of data, right, and then you can't continue the scale. So it was almost like. It almost kind of suggesting that everything should work like AlphaZero, where it just sort of played, go with itself and then learn a load of something. All that's kind of like maximally scalable, right? Because you never hit a data wall. You can just add more and more compute and it'll just get better and better at Go. And so what they're kind of turning to is this kind of example that, and they're saying, okay, so the AIs, they don't need any data. They'll go out there and just experiment with the world and somehow like rederive everything from the, equations of motion or the laws of nature, which apparently they'll find themselves through experiment or something like that. So I think this may well be true. And it's almost like, but it's almost like one of those like asymptotic things. Like, people tell you that we're all going to be having Dyson spheres around stars and stuff. It's like, oh, maybe, but like when? Right? Like it doesn't do you much good if it's a trillion years in the future, right? So
you do get in there, but it doesn't really.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the real kind of, to me, thing that you're missing is, which they seem to be completely ignoring. They said it in another one of their follow-up papers, the same guy, Richard Sutton, basically said, all the human data is exhausted. But the problem is it's not. Like in maths, for example, in maths, overwhelmingly, you never record your mistakes and the things that kind of go wrong, and often your strategies for getting unstuck or trying to get unstuck when you're stuck, when you're trying to figure out a mathematical problem.
And there's not anywhere.
The texts, exactly. It never gets. You never say how you got the proof or how you got the result in the literature. So no wonder that the AI thinks that you just sort of randomly guess, like pull a rabbit out of the hat, and then just sort of post hoc justify how you got there. But that's not how mathematics is done, and the AI doesn't know this because it's never been told this because it's not in any of the data.
Yep.
So this stuff is still overwhelmingly in the minds of kind of human mathematicians. But problem is it gets captured through a basically iterative, like multi-round interaction, especially with AIs that you're trying to collaborate with.
Yeah.
And so now that the AIs are becoming genuinely useful, even to mathematicians working on the frontier, they are interacting with these AI, and so they know what the AI is giving to them. It is helpful. I mean, a lot of them have said this, but I feel they don't have a full understanding of what's flowing in the opposite direction, which is really strategic like basically moves, what to try when you're unstuck and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Oh, we should try that. We should try this. And they sort of perceive that, oh, it's a relatively small amount, like it's doing all this work and I'm just telling it. But the thing is, it obviously can't do that at the moment. You just try it to solve a math problem, it'll almost certainly just get stuck, often on something that seems quite simple to a human.
Yeah.
So I feel like, I mean, number one, this might be fine, but you've got to be giving this stuff out knowingly, right? You shouldn't just be tricked out of it. And so I feel that the big frontier is that it's capture of know-how, specifically mathematical know-how, tacit knowledge and so on, which will be sort of channeled in to supercharge these maths AIs. And I have a slight kind of dread that all this stuff about environmental learning is almost like a distraction from that. That's what's really going on, which they don't want you to pay too much attention to. And that will be the next big frontier. And also some people cast it as like, oh, the AIs are just going out there, they're learning from people, right? It's like environmental learning. But that's not the same thing as like Newton doing some experiment with a prism, right? It's like me rocking up to some conference all kind of wired up like some sort of industrial espionage guy and trying to trick people out of information that they don't know they're divulging. So I'm not in favor of dishonesty. I think it is fine if the mathematicians are like, yeah, we want to get your know-how. We don't know this stuff because it was never written down in the textbooks. And if they want to help them with that process, that's fine. But I'm concerned that most people are not fully conscious. It's because you can't really write an inventory of all this stuff. Like if I told you to write down all the tacit knowledge that you couldn't do it, right?
No,
almost
exactly.
by definition.
And there are also lots of things that we don't know why we know it, and we won't even be able to explain them. What we understand for mathematics is actually the language of mathematics, but real mathematics are outside of this reality. Right? What we are experiencing as mathematics is a projection from something much more complex that we cannot comprehend. So I don't think machines will ever get there. That was one of the main reasons, I think.
Yeah, right. Actually, so interestingly, I don't think machines will ever get there, but for a different reason.
Okay, right. Okay.
The different reason is, so one of the disturbing things about it, in fact, is that the machines can pick up heuristics, certain patterns of behavior. They don't understand why they work, but if they do them, they find out that things tend to work more often than not, right?
Yeah.
So I agree that they won't. Understanding is not something that they have, but they may not need it to become frighteningly powerful, and not the machines, the people controlling the machines to become frighteningly powerful. So as an example, like the human body is probably much more sophisticated than anything a human, even the cleverest human, could design, right? Yeah. It was built without any understanding of why the things worked, right? So technologies can be very, very powerful without the understanding. Is kind of like optional in a sense. It's better to have the understanding, but you can still develop very powerful technology without understanding. And I think that the AIs will become very, very powerful without understanding. And what the risk is that powerful technology will then be harnessed by human beings to control others, basically to make them think the world is great when it's not so great, or it's okay, where's all the money gone? Oh, it's fine, don't ask that kind of question. And then once they're sort of locked into this position, using the power that these machines give them, ability to create propaganda, ability to basically surveil people. You can pass laws because you have the best strategy for, I don't know, hiring lobbyists. Yeah. And then what's wrong with, the only thing then is like, what, the people don't obey the laws? Well, if you can keep them under surveillance, you can also check that. And then at that point, if they get into this really, this kind of like very sort of strong position, the last thing they would ever want to do is invent a technology that gets out of their control. So that's the only thing that could depose them from their sort of dominance. And therefore technology, at least public technology, stops. Yeah. It stagnates, and it's enforced and maintained stagnation. So the machines do not develop because it's not in the interest of the people controlling this very powerful but sub-AGI machine to allow them to develop any further.
That's so interesting.
That's my pet theory, which I haven't heard anywhere else. But I still think it's a bit weird that it's not more discussed. And I think that one of the reasons why it's not discussed is because it's very much in the in the interest of people who want you to allow your know-how to be captured, for example, to make you believe that everything's inevitable. It's already too late. So there's no point in trying to hold anything up. You're not going to think about what you might be giving up. You don't care to protect anything that you think is already lost.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think it's what we were saying before, right? It gets political, and also I'll close this episode saying that the fact that some companies are saying that are developing certain things, or they are this ahead in their journey, doesn't mean that is true.
That's right.
So yeah,
absolutely, because this is the thing. They wouldn't be good companies if they just blurt out everything they know, the truth all the time, right?
Exactly.
What they tell you is what they want you to believe.
Exactly.
Which can diverge from the truth quite significantly.
Exactly. Well, look, John, this was an amazing conversation. It looks like we could have our own podcast about this.
That's right. Yeah.
To be honest, so thank you so much for sharing all this with us. It was a pleasure to have you in the podcast.
Great to talk to you, Anna. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to the AI Friend podcast. If you like this episode, follow the show and share with someone who would love it too. I'm Ana Rojo Turua, and I'll see you next time for another conversation that reframes how we think about AI.